very much. It's a pleasure to be here today. Every year in May, on the anniversary-ish of the devolved elections, we have a whole week of fun-filled activities, and I always call it Bonanza Week, and therefore I kind of insisted that everyone else calls it Bonanza Week, even though they hate the name. And this is actually our first event of a whole week-long series of events, and we'll talk about some of the next ones at the very end. Today, I'm going to give a little bit of background, and my argument is that if we want to understand 2026, what might happen in 2026, then we really do need to look at what happened in 2021 and 2024 as well. So in 2021, we started writing about how the SNP never really seems to pay the costs of governing in a way that the academic literature tells us they should. So we know that parties with radical campaigns for change who are unable to deliver on that change should pay higher costs of governing than other parties. We know that parties at sub-state levels of government, for example, are expected to pay higher costs of governing. There are a number of reasons why we might expect the SNP as a party in government to pay higher costs of governing, so a greater decline in support than other political parties, and yet they didn't seem to be. The argument was that the SNP has been able to evade the cost of governing for three reasons. The first is that in a straight fight between an unpopular, low competence UK government that was out of kilter with perceived Scottish political preferences on policy, out of kilter with independence preferences, out of kilter with Brexit preferences, that the SNP in government would always have someone to blame, and therefore voters would reward a Scottish government with higher perceived competence and trust evaluations compared to the UK government. The second argument, the second part of that argument, is that the increased salience of the constitutional issue leading up to 2014 and thereafter also gave two inbuilt advantages to the SNP. First of all, it was perceived to be more competent than a party with an unpopular or unclear constitutional position, which would give it an inbuilt advantage over Labour. And second, that the act of standing up for Scotland became a valence issue in itself. So just as parties might be evaluated in terms of how they are best able to handle the economy, because the economy is a valence issue for voters, our argument was that the increased salience of the constitutional issue after 2014 meant that standing up for Scotland became a valence issue in its own right. And so those three things provided a form of nationalist valence voting that served to provide a structural advantage to the SNP. And that argument really worked for 2021. But then the wheels came off, and support for the Scottish government fell, vote intention for the SNP fell, and our task became explaining why the SNP would be evading the cost of governing in 2021, but all of a sudden paying them in 2024. And our task then therefore became figuring out, was our original claim about the cost of governing and nationalist valence, was it wrong? Or was there nuance there in the explanation about how that might operate that we just needed to adapt for the circumstances in 2024? So we have four theories for why things might have happened the way they did in 2024 that are consistent, I think, with the nationalist valence explanation of why the SNP was able to evade the cost of governing in 2021. The first is that if we're thinking of theories of spatial voting, parties are rewarded if they hold extreme positions, so clear extreme positions, but within a region of acceptability. And if they go beyond that region of acceptability, then they are penalized. So you're rewarded if you have a clear, unambiguous, but not mad position. And so the SNP, one argument might be that the SNP benefits from a perceived competence advantage and trust advantage over an incompetent UK government, perceived incompetent UK government, so long as the UK government is not perceived to be so incompetent that it becomes a first order priority to remove them. And if that's the case, then it becomes all hands on deck to remove them. And if that's the case, then you can see SNP voters fleeing to Labour. The other point would be one about the utility of the vote. So if you have a chance to pick a winner for once, or to guarantee a winner, delivered in part by changes in English public opinion, then your vote might be an instrumental one rather than an expressive one. Another is that perhaps the constitutional issue had decreased in salience, and therefore there was no inbuilt advantage for the SNP over Scottish Labour. And then the other explanation would be that actually constitutional salience remained as it was, but Labour just became a more credible party in terms of constitutional preferences. Now, I mean, I can talk in the question and answer, but in the interest of time, I'm not actually going to tell you which one we think is correct. But I think the first three, or I'm not going to tell you in detail why we think these are correct. So the first is that, yes, we think there are a number of things going on, but the last one, that Labour just became more credible on the Constitution in a situation in which the Constitution was as salient as before, is not the driving explanation for 2024. So, what does that tell us about 2026? Because we know that there has been an uptick in support for the SNP relative to what happened in 2024. There are two possible explanations for that. One is that opinions of the SNP have actually improved. So SNP trust levels have rebounded, competence evaluations for the party have rebounded. So it's an SNP specific story, that's one possibility. And the other possibility is that now Scottish Labour is paying UK Labour's costs of governing, and it is being penalised for what's happening in Westminster. So let's look at these different explanations. The first thing we can do is we look at evaluations of the Scottish Government. These are approval evaluations. This is the percent of the electorate that is approves of the job that the Scottish Government is doing. The black line there is the entire electorate, and then I've also disaggregated it by party. And what you can see is that there's been a decline in Scottish Government approval that began almost from the moment of the 2021 election. It had nothing to do with the change in First Minister. And this has not reversed. We see a slight, and also the fact that there is a general decrease for the electorate as a whole is not so much driven by changing preferences among those who support the Conservative Party or the Labour Party or the Lib Dems, although we do see a decreased approval rating among Labour and Lib Dem supporters. It is primarily driven by SNP supporters increasingly dissatisfied with the Scottish Government. We see a slight uptick in support around the time of the UK general election and falling back down again, and then more recently a small uptick in support. Now that's about Scottish Government approval. What about the party that leads the Scottish Government? So what we have here are drops in competence ratings for Conservatives, Labour and SNP, first from 2021 to 2023, and then from 2023 to February 2025. So we have a series of questions about competence in the Scottish Election Study Scoop surveys and in the post-election surveys, and we asked about a range of policy areas. How much do you trust this party to handle these various policy areas: education, health, economy, tackling inequality, standing up for Scotland, and so on? And we asked respondents to evaluate every single party. We don't say pick the one that you like the best or that you trust the most, because that aligns very well with how people vote. We ask people to evaluate multiple parties when they're evaluating competence evaluations. And one thing we can see from 2021 to 2023 is that there was a sizable drop in the perceived competence of the SNP to handle a range of policy areas. So this is the average score across all the policy areas. A slightly smaller drop, a clear drop among the Conservative Party, and Labour more or less standing still. So if we're trying to figure out why Labour won the 2024 election, it was not the fact that Labour in Scotland was perceived to be doing markedly better than it was before in terms of its ability to handle different policy areas, but rather that it stood still while everyone else fell around them, and the SNP fell particularly so. If we then shift our attention to 2023 to 2025, what we're finding actually is that the SNP numbers are holding more or less at the base that they fell to, but that the significant drop is coming from Labour, with almost a 1-point drop in perceived competence on a 10-point scale, an 11-point scale, 0 to 10. So that's the average scores across all competence or all policy fields. Let's look at specific policy fields. So these are the 6 that we ask about: economy, law and order, health, education, tackling inequality, and standing up for Scotland. And this is the situation in 2021, which was not actually all that different from the situation in 2016. The SNP ahead on everything. I mean, Labour at their heels on education. But the SNP with a particularly healthy lead on standing up for Scotland and a discernible lead in all other areas. By 2023, that you can see the drops there. What we see is that Labour has actually managed to become the perceived most competent party on a range of issues: economy, law and order, health, and in fact what they're not able to close the gap on as much is standing up for Scotland. And the reason it's a single dot there is because Labour competence evaluations on standing up for Scotland stood still between 2021 and 2023, that should say. And if we're looking now to what's going on in 2023 to 2025, this is where we are now. So what we've had is a series in which everyone is falling. There is not a single case of a party's perceived competence in any domain increasing from the period of 2021 to 2023 to 2025. Everyone is falling. What we're trying to figure out, or what is clear, is that it's just a game of who is falling less quickly than others, and they're managing to reap the rewards of that. Now this is a kind of SNP specific explanation. Let's look at Labour in particular, because the hammering that Labour has been getting recently in terms of their competence evaluations suggests perhaps that Scottish Labour is paying UK Labour government's costs of governing. And to that I would add 2 pieces of evidence. The first is a multi-level evaluation. So this is the approval rating for the Scottish Government, which you saw before, and then the dotted line underneath that is the UK Government's approval rating. And actually, if you're looking at Scottish public opinion, UK Labour doesn't appear to be doing markedly worse than was the case for their predecessors. So I think it's fair to say that UK Labour is performing poorly compared to perhaps our expectations of how they might have been governing, but they are actually performing better than the evaluations of their predecessors. The second thing worth looking at, though, is if we look at 2024 Labour voters, and if we ask 2024 Labour voters how they feel about the governance of the UK government, the approval, whether they approve or not of the job that the UK government is doing, what impact does this have on their stated vote intention for the constituency vote in the 2026 election? And if you have a good opinion of the UK government, then 62% of you say that you're going to vote Labour again. But if you say you have a bad opinion of the UK government, if you feel that they're doing very badly or a bit badly, then only 8% say that they're going to cast a ballot for Labour in 2026. And that's relevant because we also know more than a third of 2024 Labour voters say that the UK government is doing a bad job. Does that mean I have 1 minute left? Good, because I'm done.
Right, thanks very much, Elsa. And we're moving from discussion of the ailing incumbent government, maybe slightly less ailing than the party that we're supposed to place them, to the new challenger. It's really nice to be back at Glasgow. I was here for a good few years before defecting to Edinburgh last year. As an Aberdonian, I'm delighted to be back on the Superior Coast. Two of Scotland's major cities, from which Dundee is excluded. So I'm here for the potentially spicy section. What about the foreign vote in Scotland? Who are the foreign voters? Who is moving to our party? And basically, what are their prospects realistically for next year? Bear in mind, this data all comes from our February survey. We'll have another one in the field in June. So they've crept up a couple of percentage points in the poll since then. But I think this will be quite interesting analysis. And having seen a lot of John on the telly last few days talking about the forum, I really hope he doesn't start shaking his head. So this is constituency vote intention for 2026 versus people's vote in 2021 for the constituency. What you basically see here is that the forum are, as they are in England, eating the Tories' lunch in a big way. They've absorbed already about a third of the previous Scottish Conservative voters, and they're only hanging on as of a few months ago to around 4 in 10 of the people who voted for them 5 years ago, or 4 years ago. Some of those people have switched to Labour, and others have moved into that kind of that don't know column. And that's something we see for all the parties, particularly 2021 SNP voters who might be swithering between the SNP and Labour. Labour are doing okay at hanging on to 2021 voters compared to the Tories, but a lot worse than they were at the 2024 general election. So they're hanging on to just over half of their constituency support last time around, and losing some but not a huge chunk of their support to the Reform Party compared to the Tories. And same goes for the SNP. They're doing quite well at retaining their 2021 supporters. As I say, some of them have moved into the don't know column. A lot of those people will have voted Labour last year and probably will come back home to the SNP. And there are still some sort of at the margins voters peeling off to Reform, also the Greens and Labour. And the question here, that there's been a lot of hype in the Scottish press about Reform and how it's all one big reaction to the incumbent parties. But I think part of my argument here is that, in some sense, the Reform Party is just catering to an underserved portion of the electorate. So Russell Finlay is often, the Scottish Tory leader, has often criticised what he calls the cosy centre-left consensus at Holyrood, and to some degree he's correct, because Scottish voters don't differ hugely in their attitudes to those in England. These graphs come from the British election study. The blue line is the distribution of left, right and liberal authoritarian attitudes among Scottish voters compared to the red line for England. And the distributions are very, very similar. Scottish people are slightly to the left of English people on average, but not enormously. But the Parliament has, since 1999, been dominated by Social Democrats. So to some extent, the Reform Party is just capturing that portion of the electorate that always held these attitudes. And you can see that reflected in average ideological self-placement by constituency vote intention. So this lines up quite neatly with how you kind of think of the parties on a left-right spectrum. And obviously this is self-identification of respondents in our February survey, so placing themselves on a 0 on the left to 10 on the right scale. But Reform have the most self-consciously right-wing voters, averaging about 7 on a 0 to 10 scale, where 10 is right. They're slightly to the right of the Conservatives. Lib Dems are basically in the middle. SNP and Labour are, as usual, much of muchness, and the Scottish Green voters are further out to the left. Reform are more outliers when it comes to immigration attitudes, and this is where they really differ from Scottish Conservative voters as well. So they're very, very anti-immigration. These are 4 questions that we ask on immigration attitudes: agree, disagrees. We'll lump all the answers together and then standardise it so we can kind of plot these alongside each other. And you basically see that the centre-left parties have more liberal attitudes to immigration. The Conservatives are kind of more towards restrictionist attitudes, and Reform voters are by far the most anti-immigration. And this is also true, they're also outliers in terms of sort of populist attitudes. So this is whether individuals trust the wisdom of ordinary people and not experts, and you have by far the highest agreement and lowest disagreement with that statement among people who say they'll vote for Reform in the 2026 Holyrood election, compared to all the other parties, particularly the Scottish Greens, who are the most kind of in favour of expert wisdom. So we've kind of pointed out that the reform voters of Scotland are ideologically distinct from the rest of the electorate, even compared to the residual Scottish Conservative vote. And another thing that's been mentioned a lot in the press is in the wake of the adolescence documentary and all the Andrew Tate kind of conversation, that the radical right are attracting basically angry young men who sit and listen to Joe Rogan all day and nurse their grievances. But we don't see a huge kind of evidence for that in Scotland when it comes to the forum. Basically, men and women, this is split in now by list vote intention, which is more or less the same as constituency vote intention, but does a better job of showing green votes, which is why I'm using it here, because we go on to age. But basically, they do a wee bit better among men in Scotland, as you'd expect, but not enormously so. A good chunk of the reform vote in Scotland, or reform support as it currently stands, is from women. And we can also break this down by age group. So 18 to 29-year-olds at the top, followed by 10-year age brackets up to 70 plus. And we can see a pretty clear age gradient for reform support. They don't pick up a huge number of votes in the younger group, but that kind of increases as you go. By the time you get to about middle age, that's when it sort of stabilises. And as you'd expect from the strong age polarisation on the independence question, younger voters are by far the most likely to vote for pro-independence parties, and older voters are much less likely to do so. One of the issues for the SNP potentially is the quarter of younger people who are voting for the Greens on the list. So there's a decent chance that the Greens could outperform the SNP on the list vote among younger voters at the next Scottish election, and indeed would be the plurality choice among that group. We can also take a look at, when we're thinking about how high the ceiling for reform might be, propensity to vote scale. So this is where we ask respondents, would you ever cast, how likely are you to ever cast a ballot for this party? And 67% on a 0 to 10 scale say 0 for Reform UK. And that is higher than the share that say the same for the Scottish Conservatives. Only marginally. But that's how unpopular the Tories are in Scotland. But the electorate in Scotland, broadly speaking, views the Reform Party as kind of ultra-Tories, mega-Tories. So you do have some Reform ride or dies, about 10% of the electorate, but that it's an extremely polarising party, you can put it that way. Farage also has, or Reform also have issues when it comes to the leadership. Nigel Farage is less popular than Kenny Barlow and Russell Finlay in Scotland, although obviously he's one of the leaders that has the highest recognition scores. So some of the Scottish leaders, only about 50% or less sometimes, recognise their names. But this is a mean on a 0 to 10 scale, but because nobody is more popular than a 5 on that, we've had to curtail it quite a lot. So, that's why it's worse than a bad bunch. And basically, one of the big issues for Farage potentially as well is we've also got Donald Trump on there. He's less popular than Nigel Farage in Scotland. And we've already seen him throw 2 Anglo-Speed elections to the centre-left, and that could become a big problem for Farage as the term goes on. If there's another January 6th before the next UK general election, you can imagine that wouldn't work well in his favour. So takeaways basically, John Swinney is right to present the SNP as the bulwark against reform. The pro-independence share of the electorate is very kind of coherently centre-left and liberal, but that carries some risks in the medium to long term, I think. Obviously, if you fail to then improve things in Scotland, the anti-establishment trade can gain more momentum. Farage is right to stay away from Scotland because people don't like him, but that suggests you should probably get a leader in Scotland on some policies beyond we hate net zero and war. Also, Finlay is correct about Holyrood centre-left consensus, but his party will be the ones to challenge it, and our Sarwar is right to try and make the election of the SNP's record, but it's not going to make the first minister. That's very much past the job.
Hi, I'm Jack. John Fellas in Welsh, right? So thank you very much. That's our de-identified kind of male researchers today. I'm the Welsh one, so that's what's going on. So rather than looking forward, like Elsa and Fraser done to the next time election, I'm going to be looking backwards a little bit over the last few years, and specifically look at trust in Scotland, levels of trust, another facet of the kind of political system, right? And specifically looking at scandals and how scandals in the last few years have affected levels of trust in Scotland. Okay, so Scotland, like more and more of the world actually, is this multi-level democracy, right? We elect people to, well, at least two kind of law-making levels of government, right? We've got Holyrood and the Scottish government rather, and also Westminster and the UK government. And at least among people who kind of do research on kind of political attitudes in these systems, there's always this question of how much something that happens at one level affects how everyone thinks at another level, right? So whether kind of all our attitudes to our parties are just determined by what happens at the Westminster level or the Holyrood level, etc., etc. And here is some research that we've done looking at levels of trust. Right? So when something happens at one level of government, does it affect levels of trust in all levels of government? So, what do we currently know about levels of trust in Scotland in different institutions? Well, evidence suggests on a whole bunch of measures, right, that, and this goes back pretty much almost essentially to the day that the Scottish Government and Holyrood is first established, was that Scottish Government and Holyrood is generally more trusted than pretty much any UK level institution. And you can see here this kind of average level of trust, the Scottish Parliament being particularly highly trusted in this world of political institutions, with UK parties and UK Parliament not particularly trusted. Now, like I said, this has been the case for some time, pretty much right back to the foundation of devolution in Scotland. But there is also some evidence that the gap might be growing over time between these institutions. So I know you can't see the text here probably, right? You can see hopefully the two lines growing further apart. So the top blue line here is trust in the Scottish Government. In this case, it's to make fair decisions, right? And the red line below is trust in the UK government to make fair decisions. And you see this gap is growing over time, right? Why this is the case? Well, there's a few different kind of explanations for this. One is that in people's lives, people have come to realise the Scottish government is more important and therefore they trust it slightly more. One is that there's something to do with the closeness to power. Literally there's some interesting graphs you can do with the number of miles you live away from a parliament, how much you trust it. The further away you are, the less you trust it, etc., etc. And there's a bunch of other explanations. And in terms of what the dividing lines are, in terms of who trusts the UK government in Scotland, who trusts the Scottish government, we can chuck loads of things in models, loads of demographics and things, but essentially, as always, the most important factor again and again is partisanship, just which party do you support. So what this is showing here, you can see here, for example, if you think of yourself as a supporter of the SNP, you trust the Scottish government far, far, far more than the UK government. Right, kind of understandable, predictable patterns. I'm sure none of that's a shock to anyone. But okay, so as I said, we're interested in something which has become, or which at least seems to have happened quite a lot in the last 5 years, is scandals, political scandals. So we're interested in when a political scandal hits one of these levels of government, what happens? So you can kind of think about it like, what's the effect of one rotten apple when you see that, right? Does it make all other apples look much, much better, right? Because they're fresh, they're delicious, or does it put you off apples for the rest of your life, kind of thing, right? So this is the kind of question we're asking. And we picked two scandals in particular, right? Because we could make up scandals, but there's obviously issues with that. So we were working with the two scandals that hit. Thankfully, they were pretty big scandals. They were scandals that most people had heard of, especially in Scotland, received a lot of coverage. So that's Partygate. I assume you're all familiar with Partygate, and Campervangate. a less catchy title, but again, I hope you, I'm sure if you turned up to this lecture, you're probably unaware of what that is. Okay. This is just to show that people have heard of it. Again, in this audience, unnecessary, but again, just to convince people that these were kind of big scandals which really cut through into media attention and public opinion. So what did we do? Well, we used kind of a survey experiment design, right? So we got 1,000 people, 2,000 people, we randomly divided them in half, and for half of these people, we just basically gave them a piece of text explaining what Partygate was, what Campervangate was. The language was taken from a kind of BBC articles, right, just kind of explaining it. And then afterwards, we just asked them, okay, and now, what do you think about these political actors? Right, whether you trust MPs, MSPs, UK ministers, Scottish Government ministers, and civil servants from both sides. And what we're looking for is differences between these groups. So did the people who read the information about the scandals, did they become more or less trusting than the people who didn't have to read the information about these scandals, right? So this is just kind of what general distribution of trust in these different actors look like in the control group. So you don't really need to look at the bars. The important thing is, you know, and again, maybe predictably, trust generally is lower in all UK actors. So it's lower in UK civil servants, is lower for UK government ministers and MPs compared to all the Scottish level kind of actors. Now, what do we think might happen? So we've got kind of three possibilities that we think might happen in this multi-level kind of system. So the first is contagion. And this is kind of like a plague on all your houses. You know, I'm sure we've all heard this before. People talk about politicians, you know, oh, they're all the same, that kind of thing. And so when a scandal hits one level, we'd expect trust in all politicians at every level, all political actors to go down, because people are tarring everyone with the same brush. So it's kind of contagion at one level. Then we have kind of containment, right, where a scandal at one level is held at that level. So let's say for Partygate, people see UK actors and institutions more negatively, but it doesn't affect what they think about a Scottish level, because they make that distinction. And then the final one is contrast, right, where potentially, like we use that apple case, right, a rotten apple at one level makes all the other apples look better. So if you do kind of lose trust in one level, you replace that trust in another level and see them more positively, because they're untarnished. These are kind of the three possibilities we think might happen. So what are the results? So, what does this mean? The dotted red line, if you can see this, that's the control treatment. So any movement either side of that means that there's a difference. But basically, to talk you through it, essentially, Partygate, what happened? Well, trust in every UK level actor, so that's in MPs, in UK government ministers, and in UK civil servants fell. Okay, so we got that kind of sort of intuitive sort of reaction to the scandal. But trust in all Scottish level actors except civil servants, so ministers and MSPs, increased. So we saw this contrast effect. So the scandal at the UK level made people more trusting of Scottish government actors. Now, we have these effects weren't the same among everyone, right? So we saw some motivated reasoning, we would say in, I suppose, political science and nerds like us. But what does this mean? Well, essentially, we saw the biggest negative effects for UK actors among unionists, so the people who are already most trusting of UK actors. Their reaction to the treatment was the largest. They fell the most, right? They were more negative afterwards towards UK level actors and more positive towards Scottish level actors afterwards, right? Now, in study 2, so remember this is the Campervangate scandal, right, where we tell people about Campervangate, what did we see? Well, we sort of saw containment, right? When I say sort of, because I don't know if you can see, but the direction of everything is the same way. But some of these things are not statistically significant, so we can't be really sure, right, if they're kind of real effects. But basically, the ones that are significant, the ones that we kind of pay most attention to, I suppose, would be that we saw trust in some Scottish level actors fall, but for UK actors, we didn't really see anything real. Yeah. And again, the effect here is driven mostly by people who oppose independence, so unionists again. And we'll react the harshest. Now, me and Elsa actually presented this before to Scottish Government civil servants, and they were very, very upset that they saw a lot. They were being blamed for this scandal in some ways. Yeah. So, why do we think this matters? Well, trust, I suppose, has become a bit of a buzzword in recent times. We often hear about things like low levels of trust in politics. People don't feel like they have any impact in the political system, all this kind of stuff. Change a little bit. But there's a few things. So obviously, we think trust is important, right? But also understanding how citizens interact with information about politics at different levels is very important, especially in these multi-level kind of systems, where things like who you blame for certain decisions really matters, because you could incorrectly blame different levels of government for different things, and that kind of breaks that whole democratic feedback loop that, at least in theory, we all talk about as being so important. But also, trust is really hard to recover. And for this, we can actually use an example from the United States, where we saw similar levels of actual contagion. So before Watergate, and again, I assume hopefully all of you are at least familiar with Watergate, a big scandal in the United States, the federal government was by far the most trusted level of government in the United States, so more than state level or local level. After Watergate, that flipped. The federal level of government is now was the least trusted level of government. This reversal happened in the space of about 2 months of the scandal breaking. And since then, so what's that, so in 50 years, I think, right? More than 50 years, I think, actually, since Watergate now, that's the pattern has stuck. So when there are these big changes in levels of trust, it is very, very difficult to recover. But we can focus on a potentially positive note, in that we didn't find levels of contagion, right? So where one scandal at one level means that everybody blames politicians at all other levels of government, everybody pays the same price. So maybe there is some evidence, at least, that people are making these distinctions between levels of government in some way. And that's it. And next is one. So thank you very much.
Hello. My name is Owen. I work between Queen's and Edinburgh on the Scottish Election Study and a bit of lecturing. Remember anyone that's me? In the theme of looking ahead, I'm going to introduce a tool that myself and my wife have been making the last couple of weeks. This is a projection of the next Scottish election. It also does Northern Ireland and will soon do Wales and London. So, and I thought this was a really useful thing to do because AMS is one of those unusual electoral systems. It's with 2 different ballots, and they're not necessarily intuitive to people who don't spend as much time looking at elections as people like me. The SNP, for example, managed to win 40% of the vote last time on the list, but only got 2 seats, because the list only gives out seats in compensation to the constituency, which for people who don't really pay attention is quite complicated and annoying, and this doesn't really make a lot of intuitive sense. So when a new poll comes out, how do you interpret that poll, and how do you work out who is actually going to gain some seats here? Because the list is quite complicated. So projections are great for this. They let you see the actual impact of that poll and how it would look in Parliament. And there are some great projections already out there for Scotland, like Ballot Box Scotland, and pollsters generally provide their own ones. But what's different with this is that those are not editable. They give you their numbers and they give you their projection, and that's it. If you wanted to play around with it and try to work out what would happen if the numbers went up by a certain amount or went down by a certain amount, you can't do that with these current setups. There's a couple that I did find, but they don't show constituency level winners, which is kind of one of the main things people would look for. They have no map, and it's just not as intuitive or as customizable as it could be. Wales doesn't have a full public one. I know Jeff has recently made one. And Northern Ireland has no projections of any kind that I've ever seen. I don't even know if pollsters have them. So as an educational tool that people could spread around, this is very different to what exists out there. So the idea was to have a single, easily findable website. Anyone with an interest in devolved elections anywhere in the UK can go and make their own customizable projections. You can go put any numbers you want into this, no matter how ridiculous, and the idea is that it should create a projection that fits those numbers. You can go and do this, it's entirely up to you. There should be a map, should show you local winners, and it should provide polling data and other useful information that will help you make your own projections, including some nice preset examples that show already sort of interesting scenarios or the current lay of the land. To do this, I use the nominals provided by Ballot Box Scotland, which are based on the new boundaries that's all updated in the last couple of days, and it uses a variant of proportional swing. So if you increase the vote share of a party by double, their vote share tends to double. This is not perfect one-to-one doubling, because in certain areas like Shetland, that would send the Lib Dems to like 130%. So it has to be tied down a little bit. So there is an element of logic into this, which brings the numbers back down into the realms of reality. Projecting the parties that didn't stand last time, so in the areas that the Greens didn't stand in, which is most of Scotland, plus Reform and Alba, this is very complicated. I have included Alba because they have said they're going to stand one candidate in one constituency. If they do or don't, that's fine, I can change that later on. For the moment, I assume everyone stands everywhere, which has some impact. That is updatable and will be changed. The system ensures the user input is maintained, even if it's very unusual. And if you want to do the Northern Ireland one, which for obvious reasons is my favourite, it includes a dynamic way of transfers in order to be realistic. So if it only transfers to parties that are still in the count, and it transfers them in the way that happened in the previous elections, on average. So there are some constituency variations, but there's only so much that you can really model here. The aim is not to create an absolute perfect projection. This is an educational tool to demonstrate what could happen under these scenarios. There will always be more variation than this in real life. So this is imperfect, but it is there to show a realm of possibility. So for one of the very unusual times in a presentation, I'm about to tell people they're allowed to look at their phones. You can go onto yourself now, on defaultelections.co.uk, and you can mess about with the numbers on your own. The website address is going to be on the next slide, because I know people might see it. So it's defaultelections.co.uk. It's designed to be as simple as possible to use. You can either go down the input and type in your own numbers. They have to add to between 95 and 100% in order to work. I decided not to make it exactly 100 because adding up ones and twos can get a bit complicated and a bit annoying to remember. Or you can click one of the preset examples at the top of the page. There are currently 5. I'm happy to, if anyone has a fun one that they managed to create, I'm happy to add that as a permanent one. The nowcast will continually update as polls come in. It currently is just a very straight average of recent polls, so I'm aware that it's overestimating the Greens because there are a couple of quirky polls that come out recently. But that is not my job to judge. I'm just averaging that. You can do this as many times as you like, and there are nice buttons there if you want to share this on social media. So if anyone feels like doing that and giving some publicity to this idea, that would be absolutely lovely. Here's the current nowcast. So again, I think it's overestimating the Greens on the constituency. It shows an SNP majority, or well, close to a majority. And certainly an independent majority. The SNP are a couple of seats short on their own. They are very clearly the largest party. And the Conservatives, Labour, and the Liberal Democrats are farther back, but gaining a lot more in the list. And this is, again, you can see the massive difference between the list and total seats. I would say that in the background numbers of this, the SNP are winning probably 10 or 15 seats by under 2% of the vote. So this is close to being much less believed. The lead here is very small in many places, and most of those would go to Labour. So a small swing could start seeing Labour winning quite a few seats, which is pretty intuitive to what we would probably have estimated anyway. In particular, Reform are taking so many votes away from Conservatives. Probably Conservatives, that is hurting them more than Labour, but it is definitely hurting Labour too. Here's the Parliament chart from the Nightcast again. Independent parties won votes for a majority, but they would not win a majority of votes. There would be more votes for the Unionist parties in this in the current voting. It's just a bit more spread out, and the constituencies there are more constituencies than list seats, so that tends to benefit, in this case, the SNP. Reform are likely to enter Holyrood in the next election. On current numbers, they should get probably at least 10 seats. This will be spread across Scotland, but and getting 1 or 2 seats in many areas. If they get a few more percentage into the higher teens, or they can cluster their votes in a few constituencies, then it is not impossible that they win some constituency seats, but it remains unlikely. I can see John laughing at that. It is unlikely at the moment for them to win constituency seats. They would need more. There are some issues in the background. So there are ways that you can create unusual numbers that don't make an awful lot of sense. In particular, it's those projections for green, alpha, and Reform. So if you do mess around with the numbers and you find something that looks unusual and it involves green, alpha, and Reform, it is because they are the hardest to project. You're dealing with people who had no votes last time. In many areas, the Greens didn't stand. So you're trying to project them from what is left over when you've done everybody else, and trying to get that split right. And in a way that is logical and consistent and also sensible is quite difficult to do. And under a broad range, it works quite well. There is a point where you can go beyond the range that it can handle. We're trying to fix that and trying to make it so that you can give 90% of the votes to one party and it will understand what you're doing. And sometimes it can, it depends on the parties and which way you do it. But generally speaking, it will work, and we're trying to get it absolutely perfect. The projections will improve as the smaller parties confirm where they are not standing candidates, where they are and are not, because that is forced them to zero. In that case, the projection will get better at handling those odd and particularly unusual projections. I'm also planning with Wales and also the London Assembly. But remember, the Senate is the one that should hopefully be on in the next couple of weeks. I'm going to keep adjusting the logic to make it slightly better for the new parties and to add slightly more interactivity to the maps and to the graphs. Ideally, you will be able to see the full projected vote share for every constituency. At the moment, you can only see the winning party. I'm hoping to get that up in the next week or so. And if anyone sends preset ideas for Northern Ireland or Scotland, I'm absolutely open to them. So Small Elections are UK, and you can find us on Twitter and on Blue Sky.
Right, thank you all so much. We'll get you the team shift to the front benches. Right, we'll switch from one shameless self-promotion slide to another shameless self-promotion slide, which is our website, which has all the data on it. We try to get it up as soon as we can after we run our surveys. So I'll do that in the background. Right, so while you think of questions, I will abuse my privilege as I usually do. Throughout the presentations and across the different slides, we saw modeling based on how people say that they would vote or have voted in constituency, and they say how they will vote or they have voted in list. I know I have my preferences for the way that we do that, and we all do it slightly differently on the team. So what's going on here? Jack, we were going to come to you on this one. So let's see, are those microphones going to pick it up, or will they? We need both.
For everyone to hear, you need
Right.
those.
Okay. So yeah, so we'll pass this one around. Should have thought of that first. It's not a big deal.
Okay, cool. Okay, so, yeah, like I said, I think we all disagree in some ways, but it's to some degree it depends on which party you're talking about. So one thing we were talking about earlier is that the phrase was using the constituency level votes, and looking at parties like Reform. And of course in Scotland you have 2 votes, right? So you can split your ticket about, well, it depends on what year it is, but it's something like 1 in 5 people split their ticket. But I remember in Wales when we previously had the same voting system, always the least likely to split their ticket, so essentially to vote exactly the same way as you can. And if you look now, in terms of the same, kind of other parties are likely to switch between the two, so which one is the real, like, sincere vote, which parties do they really actually like, is quite hard to tell, except again with Reform. Because again, if you look at so if you look at like likability scores, so which supporters of some parties do they like other parties, you kind of see natural clusterings of people who are willing to vote on the other side, right? But if you look at Reform voters seem to hate everyone, including the Conservatives. So I think a lot of Conservatives will often assume that they can win back a lot of Reform because they're the natural kind of grouping of parties. And a lot of Conservative voters quite like Reform. But a lot of Reform voters don't really like Conservatives, and even if you look at kind of open text kind of responses, a lot of Reform voters will often say quite explicitly they're out to hurt the Conservatives. That's sort of a big thing. So I think that's one of the things we were talking about.
So we're just going to have to pass that one along the line so I can run around the audience with this one.
So I used both in my presentation, and obviously, as Jack says, because I was speaking about the forum, it didn't necessarily matter for looking at specifically those voters, which portion of the ballot you looked at. Because in Scotland, so you've got the Scottish Green voters, for example, when they give their vote intention, it's usually about double what it is in the list than in the constituency, and that'll be even higher come the election itself. Whereas for the forum, it's basically identical on both sides of the ballot. I used constituency vote to show the transfers from the 3 main parties to that, because those are the 3 parties that realistically could make up a Scottish government or a Scottish opposition, at least until this point in time. And the SNP, about 1 in 5 of their constituency voters goes from Scottish Greens on the regional ballot. So I flipped that around and looked at more people's, what you might call like 2 preferences, at least when it comes to kind of left of the spectrum later on in the presentation, because we were kind of looking across all the parties and how their support breaks down across different demographic groups. And that gives you a better idea of just how big the share of Green support is among different groups. And for Reform, it's basically much of muchness. So yeah, it just depends on the exact type of analysis you want to do. We'll take another question.
Yeah, fantastic. So we'll start, and put your hands up and I'll come around. So we'll start.
Thank you very much. I'm sorry, this is rather a nerdy question. I'm interested in your CCAR case, and your statement that you are using proportional change rather than uniform change. This, of course, is a debate that goes all the way back to the 1970s. There's a whole literature from that period that said proportional change doesn't make sense. But of course, we then had the experience of the Democrats in the UK general election in 2015, which is largely a proportional drop, and certainly the Conservative drop in 2024 was proportional indeed. Both Labour and the Conservatives suffered roughly proportional drops in the local elections on Thursday. But of course, those are all examples where parties lose ground very, very heavily. And whether or not proportional drop makes sense for parties simply down by 2% is another matter. But I think the real question I've got is you also seem to be implying that you were that you're also assuming proportional gain. And that, I think, is rather more intriguing. And I wonder if you just expand a bit more about what you're doing and how you make sure the figures add up to 100.
Sorry, way too close to that. So yes, it's proportional in both directions, but it's not pure straight proportional gains or drops because you get the problem of going through 100% very quickly, especially with the debt in Shannon North. So the model found every party to 100, finds everything to a maximum of 100 and a minimum of 0. And it does that consistently throughout, so it keeps reapplying that. And it also keeps reapplying so that the average vote of each party has to be the same as the user input. So the average vote of the party across Scotland has to remain the same as the user input, and it is then logic scaled so that the SNP the Lib Dems cannot just keep gaining ridiculous vote shares. It then does start giving more votes in the areas where they're weakest at a certain stage of process. There was a lot of maths involved in the background of this, trying to make this right. And I'm not saying this is absolutely going to be guaranteed. There will always be regional variation as well in this. And different parties are going to lose different groups of voters in different ways. And those different groups of voters are in different places. The idea is to create something that looks reasonably realistic. So I wouldn't get too hung up on the exact seat numbers and take a couple either way. I'm very happy with that. I'd be delighted if we got 90% of them correct on the constituencies. The overall number should be closer because the list is compensated. If I got 90% constituency, I'd be delighted with that. I'm not in the Excel. I'm just trying to make this as a useful tool that people can play about and understand how AMS works a bit better. Because I think there is some confusion about the list in particular and how that works. So this is designed for that.
Believe it or not, this is.
Please do not bet based on this. If you do, I'm not responsible for your loss.
These are the sorts of conversations that we have when we drink.
Hello. So the question is mainly to I don't remember any of your names, but the person who gave the speech about reforms, particularly. So even during the height of UKIP, where the party was electing members of parliament, securing millions of votes, they struggled in Scotland, and Nigel Farage was a quite disliked figure in Scotland. He very rarely visited Scotland, and now you're seeing some polls are supposed to be there dealing potentially in second place, fourth place, and securing quite a sizable number of MSPs. What do you think has been the breakthrough for Nigel Farage, considering that the Reform Party is essentially, de-evolution from the Brexit Party to UKIP, and the party they don't have any policies at the moment in Scotland, but very similar ideals and the same person in charge. What has caused that breakthrough for the party?
So essentially, I think you're right in seeing those parties as kind of a continuation. It's all the Farage's party. And the difference between now and 10 years ago when UKIP started making big inroads in England, and David Cameron had to, make an undeliverable promise about net migration and pledge an EU referendum and to ward off UKIP in England, is that we were just after the independence referendum up here, and that was all consuming. And they, at the time, Farage was he just wasn't, you could argue he's never been interested in Scotland, especially. And he was always very much seen as an English nationalist, regardless of the way, he talks a lot about Britain, there's the United Kingdom Independence Party, but that kind of unconscious conflation between Britain and England, people, regardless of how it was presented, always interpreted him as an English nationalist. And at that point, Scotland was debating its own constitutional future, and it basically sucked all the oxygen out of the room immediately post-referendum. So it was the SNP versus however you could stop the SNP. And at that point in time, Ruth Davidson was the leader of the Scottish Tories. She was able to position them as the kind of main anti-independence party with a not disastrously unpopular Conservative government at Westminster. And that was, before COVID, before the Trust mini budget, before the Tories basically discredit themselves in the eyes of people who would go on to vote for reform later on. So it was the kind of way party politics was structured in Scotland acted as a blockage because it was surrounding a completely different question. And obviously that was all before TikTok, before COVID, all sorts of things that had fun, giant transformational effects on politics around the world. And myself and a couple of co-authors from Edinburgh recently submitted a paper on why the radical right wasn't able to break through in Scotland until now, because Scotland has been an outlier in Europe in terms of the lack of representation from a popular swing party. So yeah, hopefully that will be accepted and you'll be able to do that before the Holyrood election happens and there is some radical representation. Cheers. Good question.
I absolutely agree with all of that. I think it's decreased salience of the constitutional issue, which had previously kept Conservative numbers afloat. I think it's decreased salience of the Brexit issue, which meant that Remain voters would have got squeamish about backing UKIP. But I think it's also that the main argument, the status quo was problematic, status quo was terrible, that same message lands differently now than it did then. And so I think there's three things going on there. I think absolutely there's a change in salience on some of the things that would have provided a ceiling for UKIP that are no longer there or are less there. But I think it's also the key message is landing differently post-Brexit, post-COVID, post-Trust budget.
I would also just very quickly add that the independence issue was the anti-status quo kind of cause in Scotland in a way that Brussels became an anti-status quo cause in England at the same time. So that absorbed a lot of the people who, if you look at their demographic profile, would have been, straight down the line UKIP voters in an English context, but were pro-independence and SNP in Scotland. And that's why there was no association between education level and independence vote in 2014, as the whole entire rest of the Western world was beginning to polarise around educational attainment. So that was a big part of the story as well.
So I have thoughts on the use of constituency voting extension that I'll share with you later. But I do want to ask about the party which doesn't really mention at all, the Liberal Democrats, who do seem to be quietly doing a lot better than they did previously. And do we know where those votes are coming from, what they're doing that's kind of causing that little tick?
Nobody wants to take it, which is telling.
What do we say they're doing markedly better?
Markedly, but they're up to 10%-ish in the polls now. What they have last time.
It's I think similar to what you see in England, right, where the kind of Tory shires are turning against the Tories. A lot, at least from what I've seen in our data, unfortunately, because the reason we usually only look at SNP, Labour and Tories when you're looking past vote is that those are the sub-samples we actually have a decent number of respondents for. When it comes to the Lib Dems, there are fewer than 100 people in the sample that voted for them last time. And that obviously means that it's just less reliable looking at where they're going now. But I suspect it's basically the same thing, kind of Remainy people who are anti-independence and have been alienated by the Conservative Party and Scottish Tories. They don't like the forum, and the obvious next place I would go is the Lib Dems.
I'd also just say that there's a lot of people who are relying on the British government at the moment
So if you were Labour voted there, you were inclined to vote Labour, and you voted the previous Labour vote, the previous British government for Tories, and the Unionists, you really only got 4 more Lib Dems, and those are obviously radically different people for you to choose from. So I think if you're just alienating by both Labour and Conservatives, and you're non-conformist, there is only one place for you, and they are doing a bit better.
But they always, when Scotland was polarised along the 2 constitutional dimensions, the Lib Dems always underperformed among the kind of quadrant voters that you would expect to be their bread and butter, even when Labour was kind of humming and hawing on Brexit. So, yeah, part of that is presumably also just there's nobody else left to go to for the kind of demographic profile of people you'd expect to vote for Lib Dems across the UK.
Yeah, my question is, I mean, actually, I consider the last thing that Leslie said. So if the 4 tribes are gone, so which are the few tribes that have emerged in Scotland, and what can we expect about their electoral behaviour?
I think the 4 tribes already contracted the 3 by the time of the last Scottish election, with the yes, leave bracket basically starting into the wind. And I think actually the resilience of the SNP vote at the Hall level demonstrates just how important that kind of alignment on the yes side is, because they're almost uniformly in favour of the European Union, almost uniformly left of centre, and the pro-Union vote is now not only split 3 ways but 4 ways. And when Labour, the pro-Indy former SNP voters who chucked a vote to Labour in the 2024 general election were always the most liable to switch right back, and that's exactly what's happening now.
Just briefly before my main question, to respond to the Lib Dem thing, having been one myself in a past life of my sins, in the places that they are advancing in Scotland, they do tend to have quite a strong local council level support base that kind of builds up to like Inverness. So I wouldn't be surprised if you see some of that happen as well. But to my main question, which is basically a rehash thing of what I asked Anthony yesterday, but I want to hear Fraser's opinion on it. In the paper that you're about to publish, you talk about symbiotic polarisation between the SNP and the Tories. Now, there's a lot from the data that's suggesting that those Tories are going to go reform. So they may think that they have a vested interest in going very hard unionist right. However, I would also suspect they want to pick up the general sort of anti-woke, generally culturally right-wing vote, which doesn't necessarily have a strong tie to the Constitution. Now, is that going to be a stumbling block for them, do you think? Do you think they're going to have to make a decision, or are they going to stay fairly ambiguous on the union like they are now?
I think it's a bit of a myth that Reform are ambiguous on the union, in the sense that they are very pro-union, and I've said as much. But, I mean, they have created a bit of kind of structural ambiguity, deliberately to kind of attract these general anti-woke voters. But most of those people, in fact, previously had already resolved in favour of the union. If you are pro-Brexit, you either are pro-independence. Most of those people either switched in favour of independence last time went on as the SNP tied the EU very closely to Scottish independence, or you went the other way and switch your preference on independence. They do have a slightly higher share of people who voted independence in 2014 than, for example, the Conservatives do. So, between about a fifth and a third of Reform UK supporters in Scotland at any given poll voted yes before, but their current preferences for a chunk of that group are different on the constitutional question. And another part of the issue for Reform when it comes to the Constitution is the vast majority of their candidates are probably going to be former Tory councillors who see where the wind's blowing and make the jump in a kind of opportunistic way. So they'll de-emphasise it, what their position is going to be very clear. I should say that, I didn't realise you were a Lib member before. Alan is a Scottish legislative PhD student, so clearly he's a glutton for punishment with those associations.
On the ambivalence thing, I think you're absolutely right about reform supporters in Scotland. However, we also know, Chris mentioned that I do polling in England. We absolutely know that reform voters in England are ambivalent about the current constitution. They are the most likely to say, not I want independence for my part or the union is a priority. They are the most likely to say, but if one of the other parts of the UK wants to go the wrong way, then so be it. So they are the most likely to be ambivalent about the union. They are most likely to have a grievance-fueled perspective on Scotland. They are the most likely to believe that if it became a choice between having Brexit or having Scotland in the union, they would choose Brexit, even if it meant Scotland going. They are the most likely to have higher scores of Scotland leaving, and they're also fairly ambivalent about Northern Ireland's role in the union as well. So I think this actually highlights one of the challenges for reform. We created a joke that they should get some policies, but it's hard to identify how you could have representatives with wildly different perspectives on the union. And I don't mean different in the way that Welsh Labour is nuanced on its opinion of the Constitution compared to UK Labour. I mean almost oppositional views on the Constitution. And so I do think there's a challenge there for reform as a party.
Yeah,
To jump in on it.
No, just on the reform and ambiguity. Well, if you look at who voted reform in 2024, the modal response, constitutional preference from the SK is not just not independent, it's to get rid of the Scottish Parliament. It's abolish. That's the most common preference among reform voters. So the ambiguity at the elite level is not mirrored at all among what actual voters think.
Which is also consistent with a kind of Scotland know your place at times.
They're kind of the same as the Northern Irish side. It's the same principle. Is reform project a view of unionism, and they have official ties with the traditional unionist voice, but immediately try to take out the traditional unionist voice as leader a week before the election. So they have a very odd view of the union, and they are the most get rid of the Northern Ireland Protocol, but they're also very willing to let Northern Ireland go instead. So it's a very unusual position, and it does, I think, come from ambivalence, but that doesn't mean that people who support reform in Northern Ireland claim that they don't stand. They're firmly unionist, and reform votes in Scotland would be firmly unionist, even if reform as a whole concept isn't as worded.
I'd like to invite some further reflections on the outlook for the 2026 Holyrood election for the Scottish Greens. So perhaps particularly for Elsa, but for the rest of the team as well. Are the Scottish Greens evading or paying the costs of sort of governing for a little while? Or are there completely different factors post-Butte House agreement? And they've also been very prominent in discussions of climate and net zero, sex, gender and inequalities, and having co-leader elections with very welcome face, no longer going to be a co-leader. So what's the prospects with the Scottish Greens, and what might be, does any of that matter to the Scottish public, or is it just those of us who live in Scott Pole nerd bubbles that actually care about those things?
Yeah, it's a really good question, because the academic literature would tell us that junior coalition partners pay higher costs of governing than senior or larger coalition partners. And so on the basis of that, and we also know that governments in sub-state levels of government pay higher costs than other levels. So what that would suggest is that the junior coalition partner in a sub-state government should pay the highest costs of all. And yet what has happened to the Scottish Greens is that by being punted out of the coalition, they have managed to evade that punishment, which is being borne almost entirely by the SNP.
I would add to that the Scottish Greens have a very specific kind of their supporters have a very specific demographic profile in Scotland. Even in 2021, they were by far the most likely to have a university degree, and live in a city and be younger than 40. And the way that the very youngest voters aging into the electorate are not as pro-independence as the kind of my cohort, the sort of early 30s, millennial, like lived through the campaign, just before and after uni kind of group, who had that socialised experience. But the 16 to 18-year-olds are still much more pro-independence than older voters, and that translates into them also being more likely to vote Scottish Green. So they've kind of, any cost of government they might have paid are kind of compensated by just natural demographic change in the electorate as well. I do think that the SNP feel like they've been burned once by association and might be reluctant to get back into something as formal as the View House Agreement next time. But yeah, I think the Scottish Greens will continue to do well on the list, particularly in the kind of city areas, and pick up representation all over the continent list. So yeah.
Just from a straight election projection kind of thing, the 9% is obviously on very unlikely voting on the constituencies. That's someone else. That's a voting average that I don't necessarily fully support. However, there is Edinburgh Central is their best shot probably ever at winning a constituency seat. It's not a guarantee, and it's not. I don't know if I'm not better. So I don't want to put odds on it, but it's probably the first time they have a realistic chance. It's better than Glasgow Kelvin probably ever was. So they could win a seat. It's absolutely not a guarantee, but and that would be a big moment for the Greens if they could achieve it. But I'll get onto the list then.
I have 3 last hands, so we're going to try to get them all in.
Thank you very much. That's all been really fascinating. My question's for Jack. I'm wondering about the proportionality of the case studies that you had in your presentation, and what I mean by that. So Partygate obviously was bad, like really bad, and it got worse. Like, it was the line of Parliament that was getting fixed notices. Campervan whilst entirely legitimate investigation, and obviously there's still to be some answers coming out of that, we obviously now know that there weren't hordes of like treasure chests in the back garden of Nicola Sturgeon. It's not. It maybe came down from what it could have been, I guess, whereas Partygate went the other way. I'm wondering, like, if you had considered that as part of your research, and if there was any other case studies that you thought of, or if there's any that could take part in the future.
Yeah, of course. So this, a lot of people they're not equivalent scandals in any way. Now, in terms of what we now know about both of them, we feel that this survey experiment is kind of as they were unfolding. In terms of, again, like the conclusion right now, right? So it's a bit different. We know equivalent proportions of people in the electorate of Scotland knew about each scandal. So we have stuff about what they knew, who had actually just heard of it, that kind of stuff, in terms of the breakthrough. But you're exactly right, they're not equivalent. But this is a problem really with all kind of research, right? We can't, unfortunately, ethics board won't allow us to invent a scandal, and implicate different people. To quote kind of Donald Rumsfeld, I suppose, you go to war with the army you've got, not that you want, right? So we're limited in that scope. In terms of like future stuff, one of the reasons why good things we have with this scoop, which is part of the Scottish election study, which is like rolling thing, is that we can actually react when things happen. So we do have the ability to, if there is a Scottish Partygate of some sort, right? So like we could theoretically do the end of it, but you're right in terms of they're not perfectly equivalent. But I think at the time, in terms of the way they dominated media coverage, in terms of what people knew about it, how many people had heard about it, they kind of served the best that we've got. It's a fair point.
Police police involvement in both cases. I mean, in retrospect, it might seem like a mini scandal, but at the time, police raids and arrests.
There was a murder attempt on the front door. It looked at the time very serious.
But this is all, I mean, Jack's mentioned our data. All our data, the individual level data, is available either through the UK Data Archive or on our website up there. And one thing about Scoop is that we were in the field when the Supreme Court judgment came out, and we were also in the field when Nicola Sturgeon resigned. And so you can actually look for the effects of these things in data. That's one nice thing about polling, not just before and after an election, but polling periodically throughout the year. And we also have space in the surveys, so if you have questions that you want to ask or suggestions for us about those, then please do let us know.
Yeah, so just another thing about reform, just obviously because people are bringing up that they're a unionist, but very much a unionist party, and that's something also I think is observably true. I was reading an article a few weeks ago about UKIP, which is obviously probably the closest comparable party in terms of policy, and their policy was to just get rid of the Scottish Parliament, get rid of the Welsh Parliament, and in England to introduce an English Parliament because of the imbalance of too many parliaments. So they had this very inconsistent policy on devolution, where there's no devolution for Scotland and Wales and more devolution for England. And now we're coming to the point where reform is looking like a serious challenger in Scotland. So what will their policy be, considering that it will be a lot like Tories who were very critical of some aspects of devolution, and what will the policy they seek will be to reduce the powers of the Scottish Parliament, or will it be a complete abolishment of it? And just a tiny one, who do you think the leader will be? Because I just can't stand the idea of kids on Thomas Kerry. I think people that look like me have been through enough over the last few years.
It's a good point that you're right, the UKIP's policy was, I suppose, messy or inconsistent, as you put it very diplomatically at West. The reformer, I think, have been quite smart, and you're exactly right. Essentially, everybody knows what they really think, right? They're hostile to devolution, they're certainly hostile to the idea of any more devolution. But they're not saying it out loud, because we talked about their voters, right, their supporters, and actually Scottish Conservative voters. It's often, I think, something that's not acknowledged enough. Actually, quite hostile to the institutions of devolution, the idea of devolution in Scotland now, but most of everybody else isn't. So as soon as you say something like, I want to get rid of devolution, you're very popular among 15% of the electorate, but everyone else, they're not going to vote for you, right? Reform kind of doing a wink, wink, nudge, nudge. You know what we really think, but also we're not going to say anything so you can grow the ceilings, essentially, right? So they've been a lot smarter. Like in Wales, for example, but they said, we don't have any plans to get rid of devolution. But half the candidates that are probably going to stand last time stood for abolish the Welsh Assembly Party. It's so everybody knows, but they're not saying it explicitly because they don't want to lower that ceiling, cap their ceiling. So that's kind of what I think is actually really going on.
I'd say something very similar, basically, that they know not to look a gift horse in the mouth, and they only have a handful of MPs at the moment. The best opportunity of getting decent level of elected representation in different parts of the UK are the devolved elections next year, and they're probably going to do it. So they would be daft to, make that front and centre. And also, I mean, the difference between the Welsh foreign candidates and what will probably be the Scottish foreign candidates is that there'll probably be less there'll be less of a history of them being openly hostile to devolution, partly because a lot of them will have wanted to become MSPs in their early careers as Conservative councillors. So there's an element of self-interest about it as well. And yeah, I mean, I don't think there's any serious risk of devolution again in Grove Park. It's so baked into the DNA, at least in Scotland. Elections to the devolved parliament are treated basically as what political science would describe as first order contests. They are almost or essentially on a par with the Westminster elections here. So it's just difficult to imagine, especially once they achieve that level of representation. You don't want to close down an institution that's given you a mouthpiece. So, yeah, I think that's sort of further back to the moment.